I wish you could read this from back there, but if not, it says on one side, we're looking at one side, framed with this long text, framed within leafy scrolls, and below a liberty cap is the inscription to the memory of the glorious 92 representatives. And this contains the immortal reference to the insolent menaces of villains in power. And I hope if you go home tonight, if you get one thing out of this talk, remember that phrase, the insolent menaces of villains in power.
Our speaker tonight is Gerald Ward, Catherine Lane Weems, Senior Curator of American Decorative Arts and Sculpture Emeritus from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Jerry graduated from Harvard College in 1971 and got his PhD in American Studies from Boston University. From 1976 to 1983, Jerry served as Assistant Curator of the Garvin and related collections of American art at the Yale University Art Gallery. In 1988, he became Curator of Strawberry Bank in Portsmouth, where he oversaw curatorial aspects of several house restorations, including the Driscoll House, the Ryder Wood House, and the Abbott grocery store projects. In 1992, Jerry joined the staff of the Museum of Fine Arts here in Boston as Associate Curator of American Decorative Arts and Sculpture. From 1999 to 2012, he served as Catherine Lane Weems Senior Curator of American Decorative Arts and Sculpture, with responsibility for a collection of about 13,000 objects. In addition to his other work, for many years he was focused on plans for the new American Wing, which opened in November 2010 and contains some 53 galleries and period rooms, which is, if you haven't seen it, is really worth seeing. And he's the author and editor or contributor to numerous museum-related books, including The Cabinet Maker and the Carver, Boston Furniture from Private Collections, a museum spotlight book on Paul Revere's Sons of Liberty Bowl, which relates directly to what he's going to talk about tonight, and 4 Centuries of Furniture in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. He and his wife, Barbara, reside currently in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where he's running for a 4th term, I believe, as a New Hampshire State Representative. And the title of his lecture tonight is Paul Revere's Sons of Liberty Bowl, an American Icon. Will you please welcome Jerry Ward.
Well, greetings, and thank you, Patrick, for those kind words. I am indeed running for a state rep, so anybody who has big money wants to donate. I'm always on the take, like most politicians, I guess, but this time around I'm unopposed, so I have a good chance of winning, I guess. We have 400 state reps in the great state of New Hampshire, so it's not that big a deal, but I do enjoy it. And I also enjoy being here. It's really an honor to be invited to speak in this sort of hallowed institution yet again, and I'd like to thank you all for coming. I realize that as a church venue, we have a smaller screen, so if anybody wants to move closer to see the images, I won't be offended. So tonight I will talk about Paul Revere's Sons of Liberty Bowl and also spend a good deal of time talking about John Singleton Copley's portrait of Paul Revere, which both of these objects were done in 1768, and they're sort of intertwined in many ways that I hope to speak with you for a bit about tonight. Now, Warren Harding, like many of us, liked the story of Paul Revere, regardless of what the precise details might have been. Harding was not alone in such an attitude. Many Americans enjoy what the historian Richard Schenkman called the legends, lies, and cherished myths of American history. And Paul Revere of Boston, whose masterpiece in silver is our principal subject tonight, has become wrapped in the swirling mixture of stories that surround many historical figures. We have many Revere experts in the room, so bear with me as I just do a capsule reiteration of his long, productive, and varied life. His name still literally rings a bell, pun intended, with many people. In his own time, he was a very important silversmith and copper manufacturer, an artist, a distinguished Freemason, and a significant actor in the course of the American Revolution. However, his name probably would be known today really only to the somewhat rarefied world of professional and amateur historians and collectors of decorative arts, were it not for his elevation to the small pantheon of household names associated with the War for American Independence. And the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow can take much of the credit for this situation. Longfellow was an enormously popular literary lion of the 19th century, as evidenced by his picture on this Wedgwood pitcher made for the American market, the 19th century equivalent of putting Tom Brady on a Wheaties box, I think, more or less. And Longfellow's Paul Revere's Ride, published in the Atlantic Monthly in 1861, and later included in his Tales of a Wayside Inn, lodged in the American imagination in a way almost incomprehensible today. And for generations, school children listened to and memorized the first stanza anyway, with the immortal words of, "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere on the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year." William Dawes, virtually unknown today, I venture, also rode that night, but as the humorist Richard Armour suggests, he unfortunately had an inferior press agent and thus did not go down in history. But Longfellow's poem struck a responsive chord in the American psyche, and Revere, as I say, was catapulted to this legendary status he enjoys today. Longfellow and Revere, I think, are linked forever, as on this postage stamp issued a few years ago. And without Longfellow, it's unlikely that one of Revere's homes in the North End of Boston would have been preserved and restored more than a century ago, where it continues to attract some 300,000 visitors every year. Here you see it before its slight restoration, and there it is, I think, more or less as you know it today. The North End was home to the Paul Revere pottery. I just show this as one instance of how Revere has entered into popular culture in a very deeply embedded way. But at the Paul Revere pottery, the so-called Saturday evening girls, many of them European immigrants, learned to paint ceramics as part of an acculturation process into the American way of life. There's a nice tile referencing the famous ride. Cyrus Dallon's equestrian statue of Revere, the sculptor's first and last commission, begun in 1883. It was revised some 7 times and finally installed in 1940, as you see it here. It stands just a few steps away from the Old North Church, and you all know this, where the lanterns were hung to inform Revere about the manner of arrival of the British troops in the famous one if by land, two if by sea signal. The details of Revere's ride have occasionally caused issues for politicians, in addition to President Harding. President Gerald Ford, some of you may remember, for example, said in 1975, at the time of the American bicentennial, that the North Church lanterns were to be hung one if by day, two if by night. I looked that up on Wikipedia, so I guarantee it's true. But I actually remember him saying it. So as I say, images of Paul Revere have permeated American popular culture for many times, whether it be bags for Revere coffee or many other things. And the ride has been memorialized on postcards, postage stamps, and even in a little golden book written by Erwin Shapiro entitled Walt Disney's Paul Revere, published back in 1957. And even one of America's great paintings, Grant Wood's iconic Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, now at the Met, has been used as the basis, as you can see here, for a furnishing fabric. So you could have your window curtains in Paul Revere's Ride. And eBay lists literally thousands of pieces of Revere souvenirs and collectibles on any given day, although many listings are for Revere copper-clad cookware, like these things, or memorabilia related to Paul Revere and the Raiders, a popular 1960s rock band, or so I'm told. So Revere's artisanal activity as a noted silversmith, which gets us back to the Liberty Bowl, also rose in the public consciousness thanks to Longfellow. And as early as 1902, the distinguished toll manufacturing company of just north of here in Newburyport produced an elegant flatware pattern known as Paul Revere, and they focused on the biographical details of his life in their advertising. Some 20th century craftsmen who were notable figures in the so-called arts and crafts movement, like George Christian Gebeline, whose tea service you see here in the Revere mode, and Arthur Stone of Gardner, termed themselves the modern Paul Revere, in their words, keeping alive, as Gebeline put it, the making of fine silverware by the primitive hand methods of the craft. And just a few silversmiths here. I'm sorry, that's a fuzzy slide of Steve, but that's Steve Smithers of Ashfield, Massachusetts, on the right there. Contemporary craftsmen keep this tradition going, often referencing Revere's name in advertising or by being asked to create reproductions or some sort of Revere-associated work. Steve, for example, was commissioned to fashion that ornament you see on the left-hand side of the screen, featuring the Midnight Ride for the Blue Room Christmas tree at the Clinton White House in 1999, keeping this presidential infatuation with the event going. Books for younger readers have continued to bring Revere's name to the attention of new generations into our very own time. Even the arch-conservative Rush Limbaugh, once a popular radio personality, has penned a couple of kids' books featuring Rush Revere, his homage to, in his words, the coolest colonial dude ever, Paul Revere. No comment. The popular culture interpretations of Revere for young and old alike have been based, I think, to some extent, on more than a century's worth of outstanding scholarship. Elbridge Henry Goss's 2-volume biography of Revere, published in 1891, is, as far as I know, the first, certainly one of the first full-scale biographies of an American artisan, and it remains a useful work more than a century later. Not until the 1930s, though, did other biographies appear, but Esther Forbes' magisterial Paul Revere and the World He Lived In, first published in 1942, received the Pulitzer Prize for history the next year, became a bestseller, and has dominated the field ever since. It certainly remained in print for a very long time, and it may even be in print today. There are many more recent works by outstanding historians have added to our knowledge of Revere. I won't list them all, but David Hackett Fisher's book on Paul Revere's Ride being one good example, but only one out of many. So folks continue to recount the many different aspects of Revere's varied life. So much as Revere's life has interested historians and academics, private collectors and museums have long collected Revere silver in prints. The MFA collected its first piece of Revere silver back in 1896. This presentation set made for the shipbuilder Edmund Hart in 1799. And now the museum is home to some 250 pieces, I guess, of Revere silver either in the collection or on long-term loan from Massachusetts churches. Museums and historical societies, in addition to preserving his work, have contributed to the voluminous literature on Revere since the publication of the 1906 Catalog of American Silver, published by the MFA to accompany the first exhibition of American silver ever mounted by an American art museum. You're looking at the title page here of the catalog of that pioneering effort. And the display cases were so old-fashioned that I really love them. They're just massing of silver in these sort of pyramids, sort of ranged chronologically. This is just a sample display case. The museum has had a long association with Revere. Catherine Buehler, who you see here on the left, with Jonathan Fairbanks on the right, back in 1972, was the doyenne of American silver scholars from the 1930s until her death in the 1980s. Mrs. Buehler featured Revere silver in many of her articles, books, catalogs, and other publications, and I think it's fair to say that she probably knew more about Revere silver than anyone before or since. And while Revere is discussed in nearly every publication on early American silver, landmarks of interpretation came in 1975 and 1988, first with Paul Revere's Boston at the MFA, great exhibition, and a few years later in 1988 with Paul Revere, artisan, businessman, and patriot, an exhibition and catalog prepared by the Paul Revere Memorial Association under the direction of Patrick Leahy, who spoke to us a minute ago. And both of those works remain absolutely essential, I think, for an understanding of Revere's long and varied career in many fields. And there have been quite a few subsequent publications that including a biographical dictionary of Massachusetts silversmiths done by Yale in 1998 that has a checklist, if you're interested, of all Revere's known works. I think it's somewhere above 800 at that point, and it's been added to a little bit in the last 20 years. But relevant to what I have to say tonight in particular is an essay published in 2001 by the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, by the gentleman on the right there, Jonathan Fairbanks, who used to be Curator of Decorative Arts at the MFA for 3 decades. And Jonathan published a great article called Paul Revere in 1768, our very topic of this series, which brings us, and much of what I have to say is based on Jonathan's work, and that really brings us to Copley's portrait of Revere and of Revere's most important work, the so-called Sons of Liberty Ball, both of them made some 7 years before the Midnight Ride. And these two iconic objects offer a glimpse of Revere as a successful colonial artisan in his mid-30s at the time, and as a nascent patriot willing to risk his neck, literally, by fashioning and marking a potentially treasonous object that, in essence, thumbed its nose at Parliament at a time when relations between colony and crown were rapidly deteriorating. They're powerful as works of art in their own right, I think, but both the Copley portrait and the Liberty Ball are significant three-dimensional documents of American history. They help us understand the period and also the man who would become famous for his midnight ride that back in 1768 was probably beyond anyone's imagination. So as Copley pictured Revere, I'm sure you know this image with his chin in hand, contemplating what to engrave on one of his teapots, perhaps. He might also be pondering the future and what that might bring. And I think little did he probably realize what would happen in his own lifetime, much less the status to which he would be catapulted in the mid-19th century in the elevated position that he still retains in the American historical imagination. So let me get to the Liberty Bowl itself and try to talk about the context of its creation and the circumstances that led to its fabrication. As this series will demonstrate, I think last week and weeks ahead, the year 1768 was a momentous one in the turbulent period preceding the famous shot heard round the world, fired at Lexington and Concord in 1775. The relationship between England and her colonies had been deteriorating for several years. The expenses incurred during the French and Indian War in the 1750s and early 1760s, in which Revere had served, led King George III and Parliament to seek new forms of revenue to replenish the government's coffers. The Sugar Act of 1764, taxing that commodity, was followed by the Currency Act, prohibiting the colonies from printing their own paper money. In 1765, however, the Stamp Act, requiring that a tax be paid on any and all printed documents, provoked unbridled opposition, particularly in Virginia and Massachusetts. Protests and riots ensued, and the Sons of Liberty in Boston took a leadership role in seeking to repeal the act. Revere's view of the year 1765, maybe a little hard to see there, was his first political print and was symbolized opposition to this infamous tax. Responding to this somewhat unanticipated and often violent response, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, a decision commemorated by Revere in his engraving entitled View of the Obelisk, done in that year. In their wisdom, however, the British legislature passed new laws, including the Declaratory Act and the Townshend duties in 1767, giving wider powers of taxation and specifically adding new taxes on lead, paper, paint, and most famously on tea. So this upset people, as you can imagine. If you think we're upset today for a variety of reasons, I think they were really upset then. So the House of Representatives of the Massachusetts Bay met at the time in what is now called the Old Statehouse, built in 1713. Here you see it in Nathaniel Hurd's print of 1751, and then in a postcard of the turn of the century. And there it is as we know it today, hemmed in by skyscrapers. On February 11th, 1768, the House passed a resolution allowing Thomas Cushing of Boston, you see here, Speaker of the House, to issue what was called a circulatory letter to other speakers of the houses and burgesses throughout the colonies, stating that these new taxes were infringements, I hope you can read that, of their natural and constitutional rights, because, as they are not represented in the British Parliament, those acts grant their property without their consent. In essence, this bold letter called upon the other colonies to join with the people of the Massachusetts Bay to resist that good old phrase from elementary school history, taxation without representation. This idea met with approbation from the other colonies. I'm proud to say that the New Hampshire House highly approved, in their words, of the message and expressed the hope that it would help unite the colonies. Taxes are not popular in the great state of New Hampshire, as you might know. So this circular letter, naturally, irritated this fellow, King George III, and Parliament. They interpreted this letter as an arrogant, unlawful, and dangerous act of resistance aimed to foment discord. Through Governor Francis Bernard, they called upon the Massachusetts House to, quote, rescind the resolution which gave birth to the circular letter from the Speaker and to declare their disapprobation of and dissent to that rash and hasty proceeding. Although the House asked for a recess to consider this request, this matter, the governor refused to adjourn the session until they acted on the formal request made by the Earl of Hillsborough, the British Secretary of State for North American Affairs, to recant this letter. So starting at 8 o'clock in Reps Hall on the morning of June 30th, the next session of the Massachusetts House met in what I'm sure was a very tense atmosphere to vote on this demand. The day began with motions to clear the gallery of spectators and to instruct the doorkeeper, what we would call today's Sergeant-at-Arms in the New Hampshire House, to call no member out of the House, let nobody out, and to prohibit any messages from coming in. Basically lock them in place till they would take the vote. It was then moved that the question be put whether this House will rescind the resolution of the last House, which gave birth to their circular letter to the several houses of representatives and burgesses of the other colonies on this continent. The clerk took a roll call vote, and the members, severally giving their voice, yea or nay, it passed in the negative. So it passed in the negative by a division of 92 to 17. And thus was born the so-called Glorious 92, of which we'll hear more about tonight, that's memorialized and immortalized, as we shall see, by the Liberty Bowl. The infamous 17 representatives who sided with the Crown, on the other hand, were mocked in this print by Revere, showing them consigned to a very warm place, which you can read, maybe if you're close. So supporting letters were drafted, affirming allegiance to the king. We're still allegiant to the king, and suggesting that the circular letter, which the House stood by, was just an innocent petition for a redress of grievances rather than being a factious measure meant to cause tumult, disorder, or confusion. The House also petitioned the king to remove the despised Governor Bernard, who they felt had treated the House with contempt, overstepped the bounds of his authority, and acted in several blatantly partisan ways, which they took enormous pains to itemize in detail. They really had no use for the governor. With the vote behind them, nevertheless, the committee delivered the bad news to the governor down the hall, who was in his chair in the council chamber on the other side of the State House. I'm sure he was not amused, and the governor then adjourned the House session for a month, but on the next day he went further and dissolved the House session completely, and the legislature would not meet again for almost a year. So later in 1768, after all this, the English sent 4 regiments of troops to Boston, an unwelcome intrusion, also recorded in this print by Revere, to enforce the Townshend duties and protect their civil servants and customs officials from mob action. The colonists instituted a boycott of English goods, and several legislatures passed non-importation and non-consumption agreements that cost English merchants dearly. Some of these things still going on. By March of 1770, Parliament had repealed all the Townshend duties save for the one on tea, but by that time, however, the Boston Massacre had occurred, and Revere's most famous print, seen here in the impression retained by his family until it came to the museum, played a significant role in disseminating the news of this tragic event and giving it, in today's parlance, a spin favorable to the radical colonial view. But we're getting ahead of myself here, so let's go back and look at the bowl, the Liberty Bowl, in detail. So there it is. So once this 92 to 17 vote had been taken, the idea of commemorating the decision in some sort of tangible fashion took hold, and the decision to fashion a punch bowl seemed to be a natural one. Silver is material often chosen for presentation purposes since ancient Greek and Roman times. Punch was a popular drink at the time, as was the custom of offering numerous toasts on ceremonial and celebratory occasions. A capacious bowl like this, it doesn't look very big there, but it's about 11 inches high and 5 inches diameter at the base, to be pressed into use at the appropriate time, provided a large surface for engraved inscriptions and served as a focal point for what we might call morale building and bonding parties. Revere, although he was one of only many silversmiths in Boston at the time, seemed to be a natural choice to make it due to his abilities as a craftsman, his long lineage in the trade, and his sentiments as a patriot. So let's just look at for a second here at Paul. Oops, let me go back one. He had been a silversmith by this time, for about 13 to 15 years. He was indeed an excellent choice. And in the same year, in 1768, I don't know if it's before or after June, Copley painted this portrait. At the time, both Copley and Revere were fairly young men. Copley just about 30 and Revere a few years older. Both were Boston born, the son of immigrants, and documents indicate that they had known one another for at least the previous 5 years. And it would have been strange had they not crossed paths, for Boston at that time was a small town of only about 16,000 residents. Revere was apprenticed to his father, but Copley's training seems to have been a little less traditional. I'm sure he learned a lot from his stepfather, Peter Pelham, who was also an artist and engraver, and I'm sure imparted some technical knowledge onto someone who was clearly a very gifted young man. Both men began their long and productive careers in their teens, but circumstances and eventually the revolution led them to take very different paths. Revere spent his life living in the even then cramped North End, while by 1772 Copley moved westward to his Mount Pleasant estate on Beacon Hill. Revere seems perhaps comfortable with his station in life as an artisan, while Copley strove, I think in his word, to be an artist with a capital A in the grand European manner, a tradition little recognized by Americans who valued realism rather than painterly conceits in their works of art. And more interested perhaps in his career than in the rebels' cause, Copley left Boston for England in 1774, never to return, while the silversmith in due course became Paul Revere the Patriot. In America, Copley was known primarily for his penetrating, realistic depictions of merchants, magistrates, and ministers and their wives. Only rarely did he paint craftsmen and small tradesmen, who usually occupied a lower rung on the socioeconomic ladder and were not as inclined, perhaps, nor could they necessarily afford, to have their portraits painted. It's not known how this portrait came into being. We don't know who paid for it, where it was hung, or what its frame looked like. Only some 7% of Copley's American portraits were of this same 35 by 28 inch size. It may have cost about 7 to 9 pounds, based on other similarly sized examples of Copley's work that he did at about the same time. Copley was a slow worker. It probably took a long time to paint this portrait. One sitter complained that she had to sit for Copley for periods of 6 hours, as many as 15 or 16 times. And such a time commitment must have been difficult for a busy craftsman to accommodate. We don't know if Copley painted it in his studio on Cambridge Street, or maybe at Revere's residence. So Copley's portrait here is often considered almost unique in colonial American painting in that it depicts an artisan at work rather than in genteel dress. A few years prior to 1768, Copley had painted Revere's fellow silversmith and engraver, Nathaniel Hurd, who you see here, with a few armorial books, books of coats of arms, which were admittedly tools of the trade at his side, but they showed Hurd dressed in this fashionable banyan or robe and cap. Copley had started a portrait of Hurd in his work clothes but never finished it. So there are European precedents for portraits of craftsmen with their wares or at work, but they're really not very common. This unusual portrait has thus attracted Much attention from art historians eager to interpret its sources, its composition, the objects it depicts, and of course the man that it portrays. Literally every passage in the work, from the open collar of the shirt to Revere's fingernails, has received its share of academic interpretation, and I won't go into all those tonight, nor do we have time, but it's become sort of like a lot of works of art. It's sort of a Rorschach test for art historians. It's not known exactly what Revere teapot is shown in the painting. What we see in the picture closely resembles this one in the museum's collection, which is engraved with a handsome coat of arms of the Parsons family of Connecticut. There are a few other Revere teapots of this inverted pear shape done at about the same time, and they share the same general form, but most have hammered or chased decoration as opposed to the just engraved work that we see here. And in the portrait, we think Revere was about to engrave the pot. So this may be it, or it may be a teapot that's lost to us now. As I say, Revere's clothing has intrigued scholars. Some argue that it's cleanliness, the white linen shirt and what some people see as gold buttons, which I find hard to believe, on his vest, indicate that Copley chose to show an idealized image of the artisan at work, rather than wearing an apron as he probably would have in the shop. On the right is a conjectural image from the 1930s, although perhaps less flattering, is probably closer to indicating what the silversmith looked like while he was laboring at his craft. It's probably closer than the image on this postcard from around 1905, where he looks like some sort of Italian artisan in his beret and all that sort of thing. I think it's truly a fanciful image. And some writers, including Jonathan, have thought that Copley seems to capture the political tensions of Boston in 1768. A teapot was a politically charged object at that time. Tea was imported from England and was taxed. The linen shirt might have been made locally by Boston women as a protest against importing English cloth, something like a pink hat of today, perhaps. Thus, Fairbanks wonders if Revere's conspicuous shirt sleeve could represent Whig or patriot loyalty, and if the teapot could be symbolic of Tory taste, and so on and so forth. Now, so given the date of the painting, 1768, Copley perforce shows Revere as a mature craftsman with just more than a decade of experience. Revere had deep roots in the Boston silversmithing community. In a few short years, he had become one of the city's, as I say, leading silversmiths, as well as active in church and the Masons and so on. He interacted frequently with other Boston silversmiths who often hired him to prepare unusual and distinctive forms, a recognition of his exceptional bench skills. And although he and all Bostonians were facing economic difficulties in the 1760s, he nevertheless made several ambitious works in the Rococo style in that decade, including this fantastic teapot with wonderful asymmetrical Rococo style chased decoration, and this sugar bowl and creamer, roughly the same date, early 1760s, again with in this very English asymmetrical taste that very few other silversmiths or craftsmen were comfortable with in Boston at this time, Boston being somewhat conservative. So let's just return to the bowl here for a second. There you see it in its entirety. And let me just sort of unpack it briefly or describe its decoration. You probably won't be able to see much of this from back there. But if you could, or if you look at the images later, you'll see that the names of 15 so-called associates are engraved around the rim. These men were all from Boston. Many were sons of liberty, and they have been characterized as being primarily merchants of the middling sort. Some were craftsmen, others small property holders, but they all seem to be threatened by these English policies. So presumably these associates, so-called, provided the necessary raw material, probably coins, damaged objects, or out-of-fashion pieces to fashion the bowl. They probably stipulated the choice of a bowl, and they specified its characteristics, which are very important, or its specifications. It was to weigh 45 ounces, an allusion to John Wilkes, as we'll see, and to hold 45 gills of punch, another allusion to Wilkes, probably rum punch, the patriot's favorite drink. Punch bowls were not commonly made by Boston silversmiths at this time. The Liberty Bowl is the first bowl known to have been made by Revere, and it's far larger than any other example he's known to have produced. I'm sure he drew upon his knowledge of the form as he saw it in imported European or Asian ceramics, or probably more likely in imported English silver examples. He may have known this punch bowl by William Holmes Sr. of Boston, given to Thomas Dawes in 1763, slightly smaller but with some beautiful engraved decoration and kind of in the same vein as the Liberty Bowl 5 years later. Just to go back to the Liberty Bowl for a second, the bowl's weight gives us an approximate idea of its cost. Silver at the time in Boston was valued at about 7 shillings per troy ounce, suggesting that the bowl was intrinsically worth 15 pounds, 15 shillings. And normally Revere would have charged a significant amount for the making and for the considerable amount of engraving on the bowl, a sum probably equal to, slightly less than the value of the silver. We don't know if Revere was compensated for his time and labor or if he donated his services to the cause, but in any event, if this were a normal domestic object, the bowl was probably worth in excess of 30 pounds, which was a considerable sum at the time. In the practice of his time, Revere threw his materials into a ceramic crucible or melting pot in the furnace of his shop, then located on rented property in Clark's Wharf in the North End, a few steps away from the current Revere house. And once the silver reached the appropriate temperature and so on, he poured it into an ingot, and with the help of apprentices and journeymen and a process sort of like what's depicted in the center of this plate from Diderot's encyclopedia, he and a journeyman or apprentice began to laboriously raise the object from this flat ingot through repeated hammer blows into its hollow form. Early on, they would have struck the center point, that's that dot in kind of the upper left quadrant of this image that gave them a guide so that it would be raised in a symmetrical fashion. A lot of hard work in pre-OSHA days. The only other important part of the object, or the only other major part of it, is the footband or foot ring. You're looking at the underside of the bowl here. In most cases, this foot would have been cast and soldered to the bowl, but here the foot is also raised or wrought and has been rather heavily soldered to the bowl. Mrs. Bueller thought that it was of the opinion that because of the necessity of maintaining this 45-ounce symbolic weight, Revere elected to use a wrought foot rather than a heavier cast one so he could stay within the limits of 45 ounces. And I think designing this bowl to meet those specifications was a really significant achievement for Revere. His tools and shop have not survived, with the exception, I think, of a small spoon anvil with a good history at Colonial Williamsburg. This is a European view of about in the 1590s of a shop that may have looked like something like Revere's. Later on, these were small, maybe 16 by 16 approximately in size, might have had a retail space or might not have. It may have looked a little bit something like this. But the Liberty Bowl's importance is achieved through its elaborate and carefully planned engraved inscriptions, presumably executed by Revere himself with the type of tools depicted here in the detail of Copley's portrait. He probably drew the designs first on tracing paper and then transferred them to the bowl, scratching them in with a little needle that's at the bottom of this image, and then incising them with the 2 gravers and perhaps others that you see here. I wish you could read this from back there, but if not, it says on one side, we're looking at one side, framed with this long text, framed within leafy scrolls and below a liberty cap, is the inscription to the memory of the glorious 92 representatives. And this contains the immortal reference to the insolent menaces of villains in power. And I hope if you go home tonight, if you get one thing out of this talk, remember that phrase, the insolent menaces of villains in power. It was important in 1768, and it's pretty important today. So the author of this bold and powerful inscription, as suggested by Jonathan, might have been Dr. Joseph Warren, who we see here is painted by Copley. He did a lot of scholarly detective work to figure that out. The English thought of him as just a rascally apothecary. He was known for his colorful attacks on the governor and other English officials. He would, I think, have been a well-known person today, except that he was killed at the Battle of Bunker Hill, ending what would have been an illustrious career. So one side of the bowl is primarily a text. The other side is devoted to symbolic content that expresses the concerns of the associates and the Sons of Liberty. So in this detail, you can see a few of the things that they reference. The Englishman John Wilkes was given pride of place and was foremost in the minds of the associates. You can see Wilkes and Liberty in number 45 above, and a torn book engraved general warrants below, all within a bright cut circle. Bright cutting just being a technique where the silversmith gouges the surface to create notches that reflect the light and sparkle. The circle's topped by another Liberty cap, which is flanked by flags engraved Magna Carta on one side and Bill of Rights on the other. And above you see the names of some of the associates. So this side of the bowl, with names and references that were maybe a little obscure to modern people, was more than understandable to politically involved Bostonians in 1768, particularly to those of the patriot persuasion. John Wilkes, who we see here in a print, and again here in a more familiar image by William Hogarth, was an almost mythical hero to the patriot cause. Charismatic in nature, but apparently less than attractive physically, Wilkes was best known internationally for his essay on liberty, published in 1763 in the North Britain, a really inflammatory article in which he had criticized George III. He was promptly arrested for libel and imprisoned in the Tower of London. He contended that he was arrested and his papers seized without a proper warrant, hence the reference to the torn general warrants on the Liberty Bowl. He eventually won his case, and the cry of Wilkes and Liberty would echo throughout the Anglo-American world. The Boston Sons of Liberties were very fond of Wilkes. They corresponded with him. In one of their letters, composed immediately after the legislature's vote and signed by many of them, they indicated they were sending Wilkes 2 turtles, one weighing 45 pounds. We know what that's for by this point, and the other 47, bringing the total weight to the glorious number of 92. Referenced on the Liberty Bowl, turtles, food historians say, had just become a part of fashionable cuisine in the 1750s, so this would have been a very gracious gift if indeed this ever happened. The engraved banners on the side refer to Magna Carta. Here's one of the 4 exemplars of this document sealed by King John in 1215 on the left, one we borrowed a few years ago at the museum for a display from Lincoln Cathedral that you see here, who are home to it. The Bostonians really felt that George III and Parliament were trampling upon their traditional rights guaranteed to all Englishmen by Magna Carta, including the right to no taxation without representation. It was referenced by Sam Adams in paintings like this, or prints like this one based on the portrait by Paul Revere, pointing to Magna Carta there. And I really now know how they felt, that things they thought had been settled issues were all of a sudden being ripped out of their hands, taken away. It was a conservative thought in many ways, I think. The other flag refers to the English Bill of Rights, adopted by Parliament in 1689, subsequently becoming one of the foundations for our own Bill of Rights attached to the Constitution. And we've talked about the Liberty Cap a little bit, seen on both sides, an ancient symbol of liberty, seen here on a pike in Hogarth's hand and in a detail from the Liberty Bowl. As I may have mentioned, another key part of the bowl is the presence of Revere's maker's mark struck on the bottom with a steel die. You can see it here. It's the pellet Revere in a rectangle mark. He wasn't required to do this, so I think this is basically a political statement on his part. There were no guild systems in this country, so he didn't have to mark it, but he did, and that links him with the bowl for forever. So by the end of July 1768, took him about a month to make it, the bowl was finished. In the newspapers, it was noted on August 1st, or a man noted on August 1st in his diary, a man named John Rowe, a merchant, that he spent the evening at Mr. Barber's insurance office, and the silver bowl was this evening for the first time introduced 45. He said weighs 45 ounces and holds 45 gills. And he went on to cite other details of who was there, but apparently Revere was not. The bowl must have been used frequently at meetings of the Sons of Liberty in 2 North End taverns, the Bunch of Grapes and the Green Dragon. And it was the custom for these, the Sons of Liberty, to have 45 toasts and engage in loud singing of patriotic songs. A ladle would have been involved, we don't know which one, and for a long time a punch strainer was associated with the Liberty Pole, but that connection's been lost today. So a week later, in August 8th, the newspaper went through this whole issue of presenting the bowl and who was in attendance at the affair: John Hancock, Samuel Adams, and many other dignitaries. Lots of drinking went on. A new song, "In Freedom We're Born and in Freedom We'll Live." And this was quickly tweeted out to other newspapers up and down the coast. And the famous 92, as they said, will live forever in the annals of America. So 45 and 92 became focal points for protesters. I can cite, but I won't take the time, many instances where they fire off 45 skyrockets, they have 45 toasts, they have 92 bottles of wine, you name it. These people knew how to drink back in the day. And the image of Wilkes, there's Hogarth's, begins to show up in references to liberty on many other objects in this third quarter of the 18th century. An Asian punch bowl like this one at Williamsburg, but on boxes, jewelry, all kinds of things. These little glass medallions, Wilkes and Liberty, have been excavated at colonial sites. This one's from Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York. Revere made one other object associated with this, a tiny little salt engraved, the illustrious 92, that's now in the Yale Art Gallery collection, but lacks an early history. And the Liberty Bowl was used frequently as time passed and the Revolution unfolded, but documentation of those secret occasions is pretty scant. Its use was echoed, however, when some Bostonians got themselves fired up by drinking rum punch in the parlor of Benjamin Eads in 1773, just before the Boston Tea Party. Out of this Chinese porcelain example, now at Mass Historical, and a slightly later English caricature gives us some idea of what these politically charged gatherings around a punch bowl might have looked like at the time. So Revere went on for a long career, is a silversmith and metal manufacturer, coppersmith and so on, but nothing really was, I would say, in his long career was as important object-wise as the Liberty Bowl. But after the Revolution, the Liberty Bowl lost its not its oomph, but it lost its raison d'etre, so to speak, after peace. It didn't have to be a symbol then, so it passed into private hands. And as to conclude here, I'll just run through its later history in somewhat quick fashion. The bowl came to the museum in 1949, and before I get there, let me just go back one. I just want you to know that as a scientist, we did test a full-size replica of the Liberty Bowl, and it holds exactly 45 gills. It's unbelievable. You can see it there filled up in a secret shot taken in somebody's office, that shall remain nameless. But we thought it was never going to hold that much, but it did. And this idea of the glorious 92 and similar numbers survives. That's my pin. I was part of the Shirtlift 189 that repealed the Stand Your Ground law in New Hampshire, although the Senate overturned us, so it didn't work out so well. But we were threatened with death and all these kinds of things by the NRA and so on. But so I'm a very proud member of the Shirtlift 189, and someday we may overturn it again. It's a terrible law. So I go on too long. But anyway, so that bowl passed into private hands. We'll go through that quickly in a minute. But I wanted to get us to sort of 1949, when the United States, as some of us may remember, stood supreme in the world after the Allied conquest of Nazi Germany and Japan in World War II. The Depression had ended. We were in this great period of growth and prosperity, but there were lots of threats on the horizon, particularly the Soviet Union and China. In 1947, the Truman administration targeted international communism as the nation's principal enemy. And the Truman Doctrine of the following year made the United States an active force in world affairs, evidenced by the Marshall Plan to provide aid and relief to war-ravaged Europeans. There was the Russian blockade of Berlin and the Berlin airlift and so on. And in NATO was founded, and the Soviets, as you can see, got the atomic bomb. So there was, at this time, even though we were doing well, maybe economically, there was this concern that European countries were falling under communist sway, and that everywhere traditional democratic values seemed to be threatened. So against this backdrop, a symbol of American freedom was needed, and I think to some extent the Sons of Liberty Bowl became one tangible item that could represent the nation's love for what used to be called truth, justice, and the American way. The bowl had been sitting quietly on the antiques market for several years. It nearly went to New York in the early on, which would have been, I think, a disaster on a par with selling Babe Ruth to the Yankees. But it did become available again in the 1940s, and the children and citizens of Boston rose to the occasion and helped acquire this national treasure for the city where it had been made and where it meant so much. So as I say, just to finish up, we'll run through its history a little bit. After the Revolution, the people like Revere, who you see here is painted by Stewart, got older. We don't quite know who owned the bowl initially, but it seemed to have been in the hands of the families of a couple of the associates, and eventually, pretty quickly, came into the possession of William Mackey, who must have bought out the other initial partner's share. And the history of it, later history of it's engraved on the bowl itself. After William Mackey died in 1832, it went to his grandson of the same name, who lived in New York in 1873. It came to his brother Robert Caldwell Mackey of Boston. By 1873, it had gained a little notoriety. It was taken to the Mass Historical Society that you see here in December of that year, and by Dr. George Ellis as part of a meeting to recognize the centennial of the Boston Tea Party, and it elicited lots of favorable comments and discussions. A couple decades later, it was published and photographed, I think, for the very first time in a pamphlet issued in 1895. Robert Mackay in 1902 transferred the bowl, and this is engraved on the underside, on the side and on the underside of the bowl, to Marian Lincoln Perry of Providence, Rhode Island, a great-great-granddaughter of John Marston, one of the 15 associates. Marian was the second wife of this man, the noted collector Marsden J. Perry, a businessman of Providence, sometimes called the man who owned Rhode Island. Perry and his wife featured the Liberty Bowl at a Washington's birthday dinner they had at their estate in 1903, serving halibut and chicken, and beginning with clam broth and cups, ending with clams and a blanket and coffee. And I wonder if they really dragged out the Liberty Bowl and had 45 toasts at the end of dinner. Mrs. Perry was more than willing to lend the bowl to museum exhibitions. She did so many times to the MFA, to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, to the New York Historical Society, and so on, more or less from the time she acquired it around 1902 until the late 1940s. Mr. Perry, this gentleman, died in 1935. Mrs. Perry died 3 years later, and the bowl entered her estate, administered by her son, along with a noted curator, Luke Vincent Lockwood. They had George Christian Gebeline appraise it for market purposes. There's an example of Gebeline's mark in one of his work. They kept on lending it to people, and it sort of had been quietly on the market for many years. Francis Garvin tried to buy it for Yale, offered Mrs. Perry $150,000 in 1927 or 1928. She politely turned it down. She said New Haven was a bit out of the way for an obviously public object of national interest, which is kind of cold. But other collectors, Henry Flint of Greenwich, Connecticut, whose objects are now at historic Deerfield, J. Pierpont Morgan, also tried to buy it, but were rebuffed. At some point, this man, Israel Sack, a legendary American antiques dealer, became involved, and he really wanted to find a buyer in 1947 and push this thing to a resolution. They offered it to the Met, who turned it down. One trustee thought it wasn't worth $50,000, it was only worth $35,000. So he came to Hipkiss at the MFA, who you see standing on the right in this group image. Decorative Arts Curator at the MFA. The museum, surprise, lacked the necessary funds, but said they would go get it. And the man seated at left here, Mark Bortman, facing the museum's director, and with that generation's Paul Revere standing behind him. Mark Bortman there, lower left, put together a committee that got their act together and raised the funds. He was interesting, a very important man. He was immigrant from Romania, made his fortune in the plastics business, and really had a keen interest in American history, and particularly in American silver. Very civic-minded and internationally minded. He was the chair of President Eisenhower's People-to-People program, an effort to promote cultural understanding throughout the world. So the whole Boston community got together. Museum kicked in a lot of funds. Boston school children in December 1949 had little boxes in their schoolrooms to donate their dimes and nickels to it, and that they did, and they're recognized as the subscription fund in the credit line of the object. So once acquired, Hipkiss put it on view at the upper rotunda. That's now a hole in the floor, if you know the museum when they took that out. In a design that looked like this. He designed it himself. There's Copley's portrait behind, the Liberty Bowl in the front, flanked by the Massachusetts, I think, and American flags. And over the years, there's another view of it at the time. It was sent to us by a woman now in her later years who's kneeling on the steps on the lower right. That's her mother and her when they came to genuflect in front of the Liberty Bowl back in 1949. Both the portrait and the bowl have almost always been on view in the galleries. The Liberty Bowl doesn't travel. And today they are both displayed together in the New American Wing that Patrick referenced in a manner consciously evocative of the initial display back in 1949, surrounded by many great Copley portraits and furniture of the same era. So it's continued to puzzle politicians. It was in the forefront of many of their imaginations. If you can read that, you can perhaps interpret what the politician and former vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin was talking about when she mentioned this a few years ago. She might have been thinking of some sort of scene like this that was a cartoon from the 1890s. And they, sort of the bowl and the painting, I think, have joined the Midnight Ride to define Revere in the American imagination and to represent the revolution and early American virtues. I'm sure the Revere House people do as well, but I like to keep track of these things when they pop up. Here's a New Yorker cartoon linking the event to Brexit of a few years ago. And I'm particularly fond of things like this, the Paul Revere trading card from the 1950s, based on the Revere portrait, maybe, somewhat. And the Copley portrait may have been the source for Sam Adams' beer. There's some dispute about that. But his image has become a meme on the internet, photoshopped to show Revere wearing a Patriots helmet, holding the Stanley Cup, doing a face palm with his free hand, modified slightly to look like Jack Black. You see here, and we can only guess, what Revere did indeed think of all this. Now, I've gone on too long here, but I just want to end by saying that, really the Liberty Bowl and Paul Revere remain very much alive in the popular mind. President Barack Obama, to finish with the president, 4 years ago in a speech about the National Security Administration, referenced Paul Revere. And just a few years ago, there was a flurry of publicity over the opening of that time capsule, do you remember, that was put in the State House by Revere, Sam Adams, and William Scully. Uncovered in 2014, but a lot of the coverage focused on Revere's role and this dedicatory tablet he's thought to have engraved. And his image and copies of the Liberty Bowl have truly become commonplace in a sort of trajectory that's seen so often in American popular culture and material life. But I think the preservation of the bowl and the painting by the museum allows each generation to return to them anew, to learn from them, to reinterpret them in their own terms. Each has manifold meanings to different audiences, and we continue to study them. And I should say that official title, if there is such a thing for an object, is the Sons of Liberty Bowl. It's often shortened to simply Liberty Bowl, which is slightly different and broadens its meaning. And as such, it's become one of the key symbols of that charged term, American liberty. It's a term embedded in the Constitution and the Pledge of Allegiance and omnipresent in political discourse, and it means different things to different people. Revere and the Sons of Liberty in their specific place and specific time were seeking to preserve their traditional rights as Englishmen from the tyranny of the English government. They were not, however, contemplating the liberty of enslaved peoples, of Native Americans, or even of women. Those struggles and many others would come later, and they, of course, continue today. They did recognize, however, that as we're recognizing today, that liberty is fragile, that it can be taken away as easily as it can be granted. And as countless issues in today's world attest, one person's liberty to do almost anything can also be interpreted as an infringement on someone else's rights or beliefs. And that dual aspect of liberty, to me, is at the crux of decision-making for legislators and governments in the creation and enforcement of laws. And I suspect that balancing act is liable to continue forever. But as the inscription on the bowl indicates, lawmakers must have this strict regard to conscience and the liberties of their constituents, and only in that way can we strive to overcome those insolent menaces of villains in power that perpetually plague the world in all contexts and in all countries, even at this very moment in our own country. Thank you.